Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's the end of a long and tiring day, but bear with us just a little longer. This promises to be a really interesting session. And before we delve into countering violent extremism and looking at counter-narratives online with this very eminent panel, I'm going to take the liberty of a few minutes of your time and introduce some of the findings of a study that we have just concluded on looking at counter-speech on Facebook. I mean, as we have been discussing even in the previous session, and when we heard Mr. Rai talk about the threat of violence and terror in the cyber universe as well, one of the things that struck us as we study this is the extent of which so much of this discourse is taking place around social media platforms, what's happening online. How do you look at the kind of abusive, insightful violence that's taking place, and how do we end up countering it? So without further ado, if I can just get that presentation up and running, and then we can take it from there. So essentially, if I can just start by telling our audience about the methodology that we used. We have, what we did was we selected two time frames, one last summer after Burhan Wani was killed, the Hizbul Mujahideen terrorist, and one this summer in June and July between the lynchings of a Jammu and Kashmir police officer, Ayub Pandit, a young Muslim man in Haryana, Junaid, as well as the attack on Amarnath Yatra pilgrims. And so this was the time frame that we have used. I think my clicker is not working, so anyway. But as I said, so here's what we did. We looked at the kind of speech taking place. As we said, India is one of the largest audiences for Facebook globally, and there is an attempt by Facebook to recognize some of these hateful, insightful trends taking place and encourage counter-speech narratives to target and bring down the temperatures really on social media. 288,000 comments are reported and blocked very often, every month rather, by Facebook for their content, and that is also coming up. I think you guys will have to move the slides on your own. Yeah, thank you. This slide, our definition of hate speech as we understand it, it's speech that refers to expressions on social media, particularly that advocate or incite harm, discrimination, hostility, violence based on the targets being identified. And these targets are identified based on race, gender, ethnicity, social group, demographic group, anything that identifies a group of people and targets hate against them. Moving on to the next slide, the answer to tackling this is what we all collectively call counter-speech. Facebook identifies counter-speech as crowdsourced responses to extremist or hateful content. Those points are above on your screens. Also, so going back to the methodology that we used, we looked at 8 categories of pages. Moving on to the next slide, 8 categories of pages. 50 pages in each category, ranging from news, alternative opinion pages, satire, charity, prominent personalities, political groups. And in those 50 pages in each of the categories, that's about 400 pages in all, we narrowed it down to look at pages that had about 20 posts each from each of the time periods that we mentioned. And as we said, the time periods that we looked at, moving on to the next slide, the time period that we looked at was essentially because we understand that when there are events that take place, emotional responses are high at that point in time as well, and people react emotionally without often thinking, or perhaps even with thinking when it comes to violence. It promotes and evokes a fair amount of reactive response. So coming to what we found, well, I mean, I think there are no surprises in a sense, because what we said, and this is an indicative study, is essentially reflective of what we anecdotally and intuitively sometimes understand. Let's just move on to the findings. Yeah. So in the summer of 2016, after Burhan Wani was killed in security forces operation, there were protests in Jammu and Kashmir that led to further clashes between the security forces and the public. The narrative along social media was this. There was a tremendous amount of narrative that questioned people based on their national pride, patriotism, calling them anti-national was a common turn of phrase that was used in the summer of 2016. That figure fell in 2017 when you see religious intolerance, which has come into focus with the incidents of reporting of lynching, both in Jammu and Kashmir as well as in other parts of the country. And in this area of religious intolerance, we have sort of clubbed it into what we call religio-cultural. So it talks about religious practices, about dress, about food. And if you can see, there's been essentially a tenfold increase in hate speech that is targeted on food practices. And we can all ask ourselves whether that's something that should even be taking place in a country like ours right now. So moving on to the next slide, what we noticed was that pages which have large communities interacting on them, which predominantly are news and opinion pages in India. I'm not surprised, we're highly political people, so we also communicate on these pages frequently. They were where the maximum amount of this commentary took place. And as a result, if we move on to the next slide, we can tell you, counter speech is also most effective on these pages. The larger the communities, the more the comments on each post. The posts in themselves really are not hateful. They're news events. People are reacting or posting articles about news events around them. A lot of the toxicity takes place in the comment threads. And if you can see, so counter speech is in the nature of direct replies to some of these comments. Pages which have ideological communities, as we said, which would disagree with each other, are allowed to create a debate. On Kashmir, we had specific findings as well, and pages that were calling for a general calm and lowering of the tone were less successful than pages that actually responded with concrete suggestions and ideas, and some of those examples are there ahead of you to see as well. So again, the post on your left is a more generic. These are all also a mix of Hindi and Urdu. So some of the words that we were searching on the basis of were words that were Hindi words, Urdu words written in Roman, as well as English words. And somebody who's making a more generic comment is less successful than somebody who's actually on the right saying that, religions promote peace. Let's not target everybody from one religion as violent or anti-national or a terrorist. And I think there were more likes and more responses to those comments. Moving on. So I think the lessons really in all this is that if hate speech is reactive to the news and events around us, counter speech needs to be equally reactive to those commentaries that are taking place around news events. I think the need is for people, many people in this room, who sort of look at commentary on Facebook or Twitter or other forms of social media and say, that's really nasty conversation, I don't know if I want to step into it right now. Make the effort, step into that conversation, bring down the tone of the pitch, because if you do it, others will likely follow suit. We have found that when one person is willing to make that step and comment, you will find a few others sort of tentatively making similar approaches. So it is really important to be active and participate. Also monitor the commentary around these events that take place. And as we said, the predominant commentary takes place on larger pages populated by 5,000 people upwards, primarily news pages or indeed personality pages. And those are the pages which, even if we may not feel comfortable engaging on, maybe perhaps we should take that call. Those are essentially some of the key findings of our report, but let's move on to this really exciting panel that we have Ritesh Mehta of Facebook here as well, who looks at some of the counter-speech initiatives and public policy on Facebook. Mahima Kaul, who does similar work at Twitter. Mr. Shiv Sahai, decorated police officer from Jammu and Kashmir, now also handling cyber security. Abdul Hakim Ajijola, who's with the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and joining us once again, and David Martinon from France, looking at cyber diplomacy there as well. So, Ritesh, since we opened with the findings of a study done on Facebook, your comments on this, and as we've been discussing, encouraging counter-speech, there are two levels. One is, of course, the terrorism narrative and how countering violent extremism needs to look at combating terrorism, but also, are we willing to say that people who are engaging in violent speech online on open platforms are potentially in danger of being radicalized further, and that's what we should be targeting?
Sure, yeah, so thanks Maya, and hi everyone. So I think first of all, what I would like to say is there is no place for terrorism or terrorist content on Facebook. Right? We take that content down, both terrorist accounts as well as content that's supporting or promoting terrorism as soon as we become aware of it. So I think that part is clear. We don't want any of that on our platform. We have a zero tolerance policy towards that. The second part is at Facebook, we want to make sure that we've got experts and specialists who are working on this. So we've got a large team of experts who come from academia, research, former prosecutors, former law and enforcement agents, as well as engineers and analysts who work on a team that focuses on solving these problems and tackling these problems. And the third part, to your point, Maya, and to what the study showed is we cannot counter radical extremism, radicalization, violent speech on our own as a platform. I think it has to be a combined effort between Facebook or Twitter or YouTube as a platform, governments, civil society, as well as community and people, and everybody has to do it together. Right? To your specific question around what do we do about it as a platform, as a company, and then how can community participate and what does that look like, right? So for example, for us as a platform, we've got several initiatives that we have taken on, and I'll focus on those initiatives within this region. So across India and Bangladesh, we have what we call this Countering Violent Extremism Hackathon. In India, we work closely with Youth Ki Awaaz, which is a local youth-based platform. Right, yeah. In Bangladesh, we work with UNDP to do this, where we are bringing together youth as well as civil society together, and they're helping create these counter-narratives that we are both supporting financially as well as with mentorship, where these creatives go out there and actually talk to community. So one of my favorite ones is the one that someone in Hyderabad created recently. It's called Team Disha. This is a group of students who came together and they've created an online and an offline solution where they'll have a website as well as offline mentoring, counseling, as well as alternative job training for youth that is at risk of radicalization. So to your point of online to offline help for youth that is at the risk of radicalization, as well as reformed extremists as well. Right? So we are helping community to come up with these things because our voices are not going to be as powerful as the community that a lot of the youth that at the risk of radicalization belongs to. We're also going to colleges with a program called Peer-to-Peer Challenge, and we are encouraging colleges to create these narratives, these counter narratives where that information goes out there, and we'll make sure that we are supporting them and spreading awareness for these narratives across the board. So these are just two of the programs that I would touch upon specifically for countering violent extremism. Right. And I think there is a hate speech element that you talk about as well. There's another campaign that we have that's called No Place for Hate. This is another program that we work with Youth Ki Awaaz, again offline and online, right, where we've got people who have faced hate speech on platform, and not just on Facebook, but on social media platform. We're encouraging them to come forward and talk about these experiences and how they turned around the conversation. So we are less focused on the problem because the problem exists. We'll take the content down, we'll do that, but how do we create these positive counter narratives? So we are bringing forward these examples and asking people and say, come forward, talk about your example, set an example.
Okay, Mahima Kaul, if I can just bring this to you as well, because in India, when one talks about Twitter right now, the first thing that comes to your mind is trolling and the kind of, polarization that you see in Twitter discourse. So again, two sort of parallel questions. One is on dealing with how you counter all this. And the second is when there are people on Twitter who are out there basically looking and recruiting and identifying, as in the case of the Dhaka Holy Artisan Bakery, there was a boy from Bangalore who was identifying people on Twitter. How do you engage with these issues and these pressures? And also, when the government, any government in the world, for example, asks you for data about a particular individual, how would you jump through the hoops to be able to give those bits of information? What are your limitations?
Okay. Thank you for the questions, Maya. So I'll take them one by one, sort of in the buckets that they exist. Trolling is an issue across the internet, and certainly Twitter is an open platform, so you can visibly see what's happening on the platform. I think it's useful to kind of know what we're talking about, because I think a lot of times when we say trolling, we may mean people who actually disagree with us, and they may be annoying, and they may be, adding to a conversation. But what we're really talking about is harassment. We're talking about abusive behavior, and we're talking in this context of this conversation about people who might be promoting or they might be inciting terrorism.
Right.
And of course, we have policies against that. So one bucket is you look at policies, and you enforce those policies based on user reports. We've given our users a lot of different tools also as well, and those tools have been enhanced as we've realized that users actually need more and more tools. So earlier you could just block and mute, for example, block, mute and report. Now there are many filters available, so you can actually filter what you're seeing, etc. So I think like from a perspective of just what exists on the platform, you've got a bucket of policies which we enforce, and then you have a bucket in terms of user controls that you give them to be able to manage their experience, because you have to also realize that not, two separate users may not want the same experience. Somebody may not want to come across content of that nature, but somebody else actually might want to engage. And like you mentioned, jump in, say something, well, another person may not want to do it. So that's kind of like that safety trolling atmosphere. I think we've been talking a little bit, and things what Ritesh said in terms of just what is happening on social media in terms of counter speech, and I thought I can expand on that a little bit as well in terms of what we see on Twitter. So we're talking about counter speech, and I think different people have different definitions of it. But counter speech often requires people to actually engage directly with content out there, right? And I think that not everyone is equipped to do that. And so very close to what you just said, that don't be afraid to jump in. But it takes something for that person to jump in, and for organizations to actually get to a point where they feel that they are equipped, they understand the issues quite well, and they are ready to actually go there and do a campaign or even reach out to people they feel are a little vulnerable. I think that's one type of counter speech that exists. The other is trends of alternative narratives, which are not always prompted by very specific examples, but they are just trends that you see on the platform. So for example, if there was an incident in the world, right, there's a terror attack somewhere, you'll see people come up with a positive hashtag. They may not be people from
so
a
not
particular...
in my name hashtag,
not
for
in
example,
my name hashtag.
one
there's
classic example.
Refugees welcome,
yeah.
or I'll ride with you, or many other, pray for Paris, etc. Which is basically like people who are not necessarily connected with each other, but they are feeling similar feelings across the world or across the country. And then it also is illuminating that that's how people feel, even though they don't have any direct connection with each other. But through a hashtag, they are actually providing positive, positive messaging, which somebody completely disconnected to them is going to see. And so what that does is that you can't always proactively reach out to somebody, but if they are to see that in the wake of something terrible that's happened, their community is not being attacked by everybody,
right,
but actually there is positivity out there, I think that makes a big difference. The third thing, because I know you have to go to other, is I think that we need a lot more like positive thought leadership. There are particular accounts on Twitter that I can myself think of, and I'm sure there are enough Facebook pages, etc. But you have journalists who go deep dive into what's happening in ISIS. I mean, they are so incredible that it's almost like reading a book every day. You have women who lived in these areas which have been attacked by terror organizations, and they are putting their stories out there, and they're telling you what they experience. You have these kind of thought leaders, and I think that the more voices that come out and actually are out there, that really helps, helps organization understand what is the messaging that works, what is the strategy to employ, and I think certainly with the platforms in government, it informs that conversation.
Right. Mr. Sahai, if I can come to you next. It was important to have these two social media, behemoths really on this platform, because a lot of what's going on in terms of our opinions, our political opinions, are being expressed in these spaces. But the assumption is that whoever is being radicalized is not being radicalized necessarily on open platforms like this, where you and I can jump into the conversation and comment and bring down the pitch. But there is a process that takes place further once somebody may or may not be identified. How should the state intervene or perhaps seek support in countering narratives, whether it's online or offline? Because presumably what happens online is just a mirror also of what's happening offline as well. Your challenge is in countering violent extremism.
Well, I think what was said by both the people from the social media is, are we in a position to be able to absorb the velocity and the volume of what is happening? And we all understand that data is of prime importance to both your organizations, because that is what you run on. And that is the problem. The problem is that the net has pervaded in a manner that it has basically defied sovereignty. And states function on the principle of sovereignty. So you've got actually platforms today which can cut across government and defy government. Now, we all understand that confidentiality of data is what makes these platforms run. So when are you going to share that data with law enforcement so that law enforcement can become effective in countering the kind of things that are happening? That is actually the real conflict that is there, that exists between government and social media platforms. I don't want to get into the bone picking with them about, you did this and we didn't do that. So the question is that, one is that the whole thing about social media and the internet has questioned the fundamentals of government. And today the challenge is that what is that government should do? Now, government is not an entity outside societies and communities. It has to run with the cooperation of the social media. So the tool that is being used to proliferate this thought has to be the same tool that has to be used to counter the thought. Now, the issue is that who's going to put out that content, in what volume? And there is where the strengths of communities will lie. India has got its own strengths because of the narrative that has existed historically in India. It's good to see that a country like ours, which has got such a large Muslim population, the second largest Muslim population in the world, has subscribed to the Islamic State in a very small, insignificant number.
Yeah.
So what is the strength that the Indian community has, the Indian Muslim community has, which does not allow it to happen? Now, you pulled out examples from Kashmir, but Kashmir is not a question of Islamic radicalization. It has had a very long-standing political problem.
Correct.
So let's not confuse those issues. Kashmir, there is some amount of radicalization that is taking place there, but we must understand one thing very clearly, that Islamic radicalization or any kind of radicalization does not start with religion. It does not start with theology. It actually starts from very mundane things. It gets translated to theology when somebody is trying to find justification for his violence. And if you look at the entire narrative, if you want to confine yourself to the whole issue of the Islamic radicalization, it is what? It is aspirational. They are giving you the same things that you're looking for in this world. That's a good life, good food and drink, and in the men's context, good women. But it's not in this world, it's in the next world. So you are willing to stake everything that you have for an aspiration that is going to be given to you in the next world. The counter to that obviously is that you should strive for it in this world. Now, how do you put that narrative out? Now, of course, you can couch it in a lot of theology, and a lot of that theology is also actually fake. I mean, if you take the example of Kashmir, the entire thing of Ghazwat al-Hind, where is the reference to it in the Quran? Or even if you talk about the entire concept of the Islamic State, where is the legitimacy in the Quran? So I think that is the whole thing, and that about how a completely fake narrative has been created in fake theology and put out there.
So
and nobody is actually contesting it.
So in fact, from the community, you need more people to come out there and correct the narratives around the texts that exist as well.
I think the biggest challenge that we face in this context is that the moderate voices are not speaking up.
because I think people have a thin skin when it comes to the volume of abuse that they get in return. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Mr. Ajijola, I want to ask you, when we were chatting earlier, you made a very interesting comment. You said that governments don't have a lot of credibility these days, and we don't want social media to be our censors. So can there be an interlocutor in between, in the form of civil society, community organizations, that might be able to step up and play a role that is happening offline, but also then translates into online initiatives where you can reach a wider number of people across these borders? As both Mr. Sahai and Mahima have pointed out, we're all now existing in a borderless world.
The quick answer, I think, is yes. Having said that, let me just take a couple of steps back, with your permission. First of all, I don't think it's about the moderates, the so-called moderates, not speaking. I think it's the so-called moderates not being listened to. Having said that, I think the bee in my bonnet that I really would like to get off my chest today is really the intertwining of hate speech and fake news. And really, I look at the issue of the weaponization of hate speech and fake news. I think that's one of the big challenges we face today. And so the question for me is, what are we going to do about it? And I would suggest we consider the following. First of all, we have to identify the sources of hate speech and fake news. Once we've identified them, we have to find ways of discrediting, discouraging, derailing, and diminishing those sources. And there are ways to do this. In addition to that, I think the third pillar of dealing with this weaponization of fake news and hate speech is drowning the fake news and hate speech with positive narratives. And this is where I think I digress slightly from my colleague here. It's really not about the moderates speaking. Are we listening to them? Are we giving them traction? Is it reported? Because the truth of the matter is that when supposed moderates speak, it doesn't capture the headlines, and this is the truth. Now, having said that, this weaponization of fake news and hate speech is being undertaken by all kinds of people. And we've seen ethnic chauvinists all over the world. We recently had the so-called white supremacists in the US. We have our own ethnic chauvinists in Nigeria. We also have ethnic chauvinists in this country. I think we've seen some level of ethnic chauvinism even in Spain in recent times. And truth be told, for those of you who maybe know a little bit about the Bible, these things have been going on since Cain and Abel. But really, you are correct. We do not, I think, want as a society for Twitter and Facebook to be our censors. And they're not even equipped to do so. And I think, as I was told just a few minutes before we got it, they don't even want the job. But the challenge you have is that government simply does not have the street credibility to provide some of these alternate narratives. And so, yes, I would agree that at the end of the day, this is a major opening, a major opportunity for civil society to be able to generate the alternate narratives, the credible narratives that some people, you know, again, when you look at people going on the path of extremism, it's a path, it's a spectrum. You don't wake up one morning and you are, at least typically, you don't wake up one morning and you're an extremist. So I think that if we can find ways to encourage some of our colleagues in civil society to provide these narratives. And again, two quick examples that come to mind from the world of fake news. I believe in the US you have sites like Snopes, like Fact Check. Snopes, I believe, is a husband and wife team. It's not a big operation. Now, you may say, well, are they credible? Well, they've gained credibility over time. So, but the point really is that it is possible. But you also have government interventions. For example, again, in the US, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, I think FEMA or something it's called, on their website, they actually have a place where you can go and look up rumors. So after Hurricane Harvey and some of these other things, a number of rumors was swirling around, and you can actually go there and check out, is your rumor there? You see, and then you at least get the government perspective.
Yeah.
Whether you believe it's a credible narrative or not is a different issue. And I think one of the big challenges we have as a society is that the custodians of the media messaging in government have not really understood that things have changed. I'll give you an example. In my country, our president has not been well, and sometimes his media managers post something on WhatsApp, and they put, in text, signed so-and-so media manager. I could just as well have, composed it. And they do not give me a URL that I can click on to go to a government website to check.
Right.
Is this message supposedly from the chief executive's press secretary actually correct? So I think even the media managers, especially in government, all over the world, need to understand that things have changed. They need to be more responsive. I don't want to say more responsible, but certainly in terms of time, more responsive, but also to provide those kind of things, a simple URL to a credible page, India.gov, and you would see, oh, it's true, the president actually, is going to the UN or something like that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Martinon, you're coming in at the end of these comments, but I think Mr. Ajijola has brought in a very interesting element, as he calls the weaponization of fake news. Now, also, talking about what happened in the United States, for example, in Europe, one is seeing a lot of debates take place on what social media may or may not be doing. The European Union has passed a very strict order on hate speech on Twitter and Facebook recently, saying that they will, in essence, try and shut them down if they don't control what's going on, so controlling the narrative over there. But I'd like to ask you, as a state that is trying to fight a radical Islamic terror problem in its own borders, how much do you think the focus on Islamic terror is taking away from the fact that there are reactions to this as well taking place? Mr. Ajijola pointed out white supremacy in the United States. In Britain, I know that some neo-Nazi groups were also proscribed under their CVE and PVE kind of efforts last December. Do you think there is a need for a lot of Western Europe also to recognize that one problem is also now feeding into the other, and it's becoming hard to separate strands of violent extremism before you're trying to look at countering it?
Well, I'd say our first priority is to try and tackle the initial problem. And the initial problem is this wave of terrorist attacks in Paris and in France in general. So, of course, it creates reaction, and why wouldn't there be any reaction? Of course. But I would like to come back just 1 second to what Abdul Hakim has just said about the credibility of governments when it comes to producing counter-narrative contents. I do agree with you on the fact that governments are not the right source for positive content. When someone is in this process, has entered this process of radicalization, he puts himself in the posture of being basically alone against the rest of the world, and any content which could provoke some form of suspicion of being governmental, or, by the way, even platform-led message, is in a way tainted. And I think at least it's useless, at worst it's counterproductive. Because it's going to feed the feeling that there is a conspiracy, that it's not the truth, and so it's not the way we should do things. So I understand that platforms have programs, etc. We do things too, and it took me some time to explain that in Paris. We need to do things, we can't advertise about them. So we're funding programs in France for NGOs from civil society. We're funding programs in other countries, and especially countries from where terrorists have been came from. But this has to remain discreet, almost clandestine. And there is another reason for that. If you consider the last attacks in France, the conclusion we can draw from that is that there isn't one typical terrorist. The man who perpetrated the massive terrorist attack in Nice last year during the 14th of July was a violent man. He was a drug addict. He was bisexual. So definitely not the typical guy you can find in ISIS. Last year, 2 teenage girls converted, radicalized, stabbed the policeman who came to arrest them. Who can talk to them? Who can convince them? Certainly not the government. Maybe their parents or elder figures, but most probably people who in a way look like them. So this is the reason why we are absolutely convinced that we need to crowdsource the production of counter-narrative. So that's one thing. There is another topic in what keeps us busy in terms of fighting against the use of terrorism, of internet for terrorism purposes. It's the fact that I don't question the will from the platforms, but we do believe that it's not enough. So 2 weeks ago in New York at the UN General Assembly, Prime Minister May, President Macron, Prime Minister Gentiloni from Italy took the floor. I organized an event to talk about the way we need to cooperate, and notably what we feel as weaknesses in the process of taking down content. And I'm not, from the French standards, there is no hate content. There are just illegal contents. We're not talking about hate content. We face contents that are illegal because they are racist, because they are anti-Semitic, because they are anti-Islamic, and because they advocate for terrorism. All this is banned by the law, is forbidden by law. What we see is, yes, the figures are growing, and again, we don't question the will, but we know it's not enough. And so what we need is that the platform find the ways and means to take down those contents in a very short, under a very short delay. So their reaction was say, we don't even know if we can make it fine, but the thing is, if an illegal content advocating for terrorism is posted, it is reposted, 70% of the reposting, of the dissemination, happens in the first hour. So unless we find a way to take them down in the first hour, we will always face the problem of reposting on other social medias, etc. So that's one thing. The second thing, and on this we found an agreement, is the fact that, of course, we're talking to Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, and Microsoft, because your market share is huge. But there are other social medias. There are other apps, and we need to work with them too. So most of the time, they're not rich enough to have a public policy team that can handle those issues.
Yep.
What we would need is that they could access the hash database that is now hosted by Facebook, and that they can make the most of it in order to identify the illicit contents that they need to take down,
Right.
whatever happens. And there is a last topic, which is algorithmic confinement, which is basically the fact that if you type, let's say, the word jihad on a search engine, you can be sure that as a user you will be served jihadist contents for the next 10 years. And so the problem is that if you are already in that phase of radicalization, and if you are only fed by the same time of content,
Right.
then it's a problem.
Okay, I'm gonna actually, we have about 10 more minutes, so I have a lot more questions for the panel, but I'm sure that the audience does as well, so I'm gonna be nice and open it up. We have time for 10 minutes of questions? Right, okay. You had your hand up first. 1, 2, 3. If you could just go to the microphone, introduce yourself. Make your questions extremely brief and pointed so we can get as many as we can in.
Hi Ritesh. Since WhatsApp is being taken care by Facebook, lots of menace and hate speech has been circulated through WhatsApp. I have seen you, Mahima, on lots of forum talking.
Your question, sir, please.
My
We're really
question
running
is
out of
what
time.
you are doing for the WhatsApp,
Sure.
because
Okay.
I haven't seen any development
All
on this
right,
side.
okay. Second question, we'll just take a couple together and then, yeah, go ahead.
Myself Ashish Gupta from School of Law, IP University. Yesterday we read the news that Germany has enacted a secure enforcement law on social networks for hate speech. So I want to ask her, what is the viewpoint of the Facebook and Twitter towards this law, because this law is not for the users who post the hate speech comments, but for the companies who
Okay.
fail to comply.
All right, all right. What is your view? Yeah, third question from there.
Samir Patil from Gateway House, and my question is for Mahima and Ritesh. Now, in the earlier session on the video on demand, we heard about Netflix linking every user to a government ID. Is there a way in which Twitter and Facebook can implement such a step in order to avoid users posting any offensive or extremist content, or even to not engage in cyber trolling or cyberbullying?
Okay, all right, so not engage. All the questions are for social media, expectedly. I'll come to you in a minute, sir. Very quickly on WhatsApp, Ritesh, and then Mahima, you can take the other question. Yeah, Ritesh, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, so I think to the question pertaining around hate speech being circulated specifically on WhatsApp. So as you know, WhatsApp is a platform that is end-to-end encrypted, which means that we don't have access to any of the information that exists on users' profile. But it's possible for users to have a lot of control for WhatsApp and make sure that either you are blocking people who are sending this content, so that you have the ability to make sure that you're not seeing this content and you actually opt out of it, and you also have the ability to report the content, although like if we are not able to see the content that's being posted, because as I said again, it's an end-to-end encrypted platform. There is a team that looks at the reports that are generated by the users and acts on repeat offenders. Right. So I think that's the answer that I would give you to make sure that you have the information that you need.
But I think therefore also WhatsApp is tougher to monitor as a result. Mahima, the second question?
Yeah, so I'll just, a lot of people do feel that if accounts are tied to a real name policy, which some platforms do follow, maybe there will be no hatred, or there will be no trolling, or there will be, and I think that is not necessarily true according to me. Twitter, of course, has taken a decision to have anonymity on the platform, so you don't need to give your real name. And I think that if you look around at social media and you look around at the content being produced, but you also get off social media and you look at speeches that are made, and you look at the leaders whose names are out there, people who are propagating terror, people who are propagating hate, are not necessarily people who are hiding behind the curtain. In fact, many times they want you to know who they are, and they want to build followings, and they want to be famous. So I don't think it's necessarily an obvious thing. But having said that, yes, in terms of our involvement as a platform, now we are encouraging people to actually give us more information. And one of the things that happens is that if you are reported and you violated a policy, one of the enforcement mechanisms that we are applying is that you have to give in some cases, your phone number, and you have to verify that phone number. And we hope that mentally that's a deterrent, because previously the platform did not have your phone number, for example, but now they do. And so should you get into further trouble or legal trouble, that's information that can be given, to the agencies. So not necessarily is my question, but yes, certainly as a platform we are moving towards more enforcement.
And I know your question was to Twitter and Facebook about the German order, but I'm going to actually ask Mr. Sahai to come in on that, because I think one of the challenges for counter-terrorism methods, whether it's actual hard state counter-terror or even countering radical narratives as we're talking about, is being able to identify people who are using these platforms for purposes that are other than positive. So you've had obviously attempts to interact and deal with these platforms to get user data, and I think that's one of the challenges Mr. Martinon and you were discussing earlier as well.
Yeah, because I think that's the issue that I was trying to raise earlier also, that is the social media platforms restrict the kind of data they allow to come out. So if you are not, how would you expect law enforcement to be able to identify those people if the data is going to be only 2 or 3% accessible to the law enforcement?
Right.
Yes, there are legal procedures. And now if you want to actually come down to the fundamentals, let me tell you about an actual investigation that is taking place. I'm sorry, Ritesh, I said I wouldn't want to do it, but I'm forced to do it. A very premier investigating agency asked Facebook for data on a specific user which is in an investigation of a terrorist strike. The Facebook said that the server is lying in Ireland, so you need to ask Ireland. Ireland was asked. The government of Ireland turned around and said that the data actually belongs to Facebook, so ask Facebook. Now, we have been tossed between these two, and the data is still not with us.
So, Mr. Martinon, this comes back to the point you were saying about the first hour, which is very crucial. I know that these sites are also using something called PhotoDNA. So if it's a visual image, for example, it will be taken down within minutes of it going up based on the reading of that DNA. I think vocabulary and language is much harder.
Well, that's why I'm optimistic, and I'm sure they will make it very soon.
Okay, all right.
Because they're already able to do it for child pornography, for
yeah.
for
so why not for
protected contents, protected by IP content. So I'm sure you will get there very soon.
Okay, I know you had a question here, sir, and one more there. So 1, 2, 3. All right, here, go ahead.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I was a member of the IPS for a number of years. I think the discussion today has been very useful, but I think you missed the point that the problem becomes very serious if the state machinery itself becomes a part of the problem rather than a part of the solution. In Gujarat, I was a member of the Citizens Tribunal on Gujarat.
So just a brief question, if I can request you, because we have like 3 more minutes before the minister comes.
But you will have to devise a methodology for dealing with the participation of the state machinery itself.
All right.
Not only in the hate speech,
so
but also encouraging the state speech. You will have to democratize society, democratize governance, organize political movements and social structures.
Got it, sir.
Socialist society, we'll have to build up
got it, sir. That's a comment more than a question. Yeah. There was a gentleman there with a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Stuart Brown from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Echoing what Ambassador Martinon was saying, and you heard from my minister yesterday what the UK, France and other countries have been talking about and what we would like to see happening. My question is for the social media companies on the stage. What does success look like for you in this space?
Okay, all right. What does success look like? And the last question, yeah.
Hello. The last question is like, most of the, we are thinking of solutions to neutralize the negative narrative. So most of the negative narrative is available on the microblogging sites. Whereas the positive narrative is on the macro blogs, we can say like journals, editorials, opinion editions. So how do we plug this gap between microblogging and macroblogging, we can say?
Okay, that's a good question. Do you want to take on his question about what does success look like? I think both of you, just very brief answers each.
Yeah, and I think I'll try to answer it in like just one sentence. For us, success looks like taking down content that is offending the policies as quickly as possible once we find out that it exists on the site. I think for us, that's what we strive for, and that's what we'll continue to strive for.
So I would agree with Ritesh, and I'll just add one thing to that, which is I think that is what success looks like, because that's what those are the metrics that you can measure. You know, you can measure how many accounts you took down. You can measure how many comments or tweets were bounced. I think those are the things that you can measure. I think intangible, what you can't measure, but is part of success, is how many people were successfully de-radicalized or prevented from getting radicalized, because there is alternative narrative out there, or there's counter speech out there, and I don't know if we can actually measure that. So that's the intangible success that is out there. And to the person who asked how you can marry microblogging, and so we've doubled the number of characters as a test run on Twitter, so maybe maybe we can solve it if it goes well, the experiment.
So 280 characters, if you want to tweet longer, you can. Mr. Ajijola, I want you to come in on that last question as well, because I think civil society can bridge the gap between macro blogging and microblogging, really.
And actually, it's very much about drowning
out the noise,
the message. But if I may just conclude with a couple of things, please. First of all, we have to understand that the importance of some of these things is that each and every one of you in this room, each and every one of us, has a right to know the truth in a timely manner. And that right is actually negated when hate speech, fake news is circulated. It undermines our democracy. But, and having said this, we have a social responsibility, each and every one of us, to think critically. But has the state, through the education system, taught us how to think critically? I know in my country, critical thinking is a big problem. But if I may just wrap up with another thing I would suggest the state do, because this undermining of our democracy, I believe we've seen it. Now, some of us here may not agree whether it has been the case. But I think in India, we actually have the Information Technology Act, Section 70A, actually empowers the government to declare certain things as critical national information infrastructure. And I would suggest, because I've suggested in my country, that we consider designating the electoral system, that is the process, not the individual computers,
right,
as a critical national infrastructure, because at the end of the day, it's these bad guys, they don't need to hack the machines. They hack the voter's mind.
Right, all right. And on that note, I think we have to end it. We have a minister waiting to join us for our closing session as well. Thank you all very much. I think the conversation on counter-narratives is one that we need to continue even when we leave the room, because the more we talk about it, the more we participate in the counter-narratives and the more effective they might be. Thank you all very much for being on the panel.